So now let's take a really close look at the nephrons, which remember were the functional unit of the kidney. And the nephrons are responsible for reabsorption and secretion of water and different solutes. And so there's three ways that the nephron is. There's three characteristics of the nephron that are very important to help make this reabsorption of water and solute happen. First, there's an increasing concentration of interstitial fluid deeper into the medulla, as you can see here. Okay. As you go down the medulla, the osmolarity is increasing, and that we're going to see why that's important in a second. Second is the loop structure of the nephron, and this loop structure is going to get you access to this deeper concentration as you go down, and it's going to go back up, and we're going to see again why that helps. Finally, there's a variable permeability of the nephron to water in different segments. So you can see here in this dotted line on the top right, all this up to the descending loop of Henle is permeable to water. After that, in between these two dotted lines, from the ascending loop of the loop of Henle all the way to the early distal convoluted tubule, all of that is non-permeable to water. And finally, after that is all dependent on ADH. So if you don't have any ADH activity, there is no aquaporins and it's not permeable to water. If you do have ADH, then water can come and go. Okay, so let's see how water and different solutes move. First, in the proximal convoluted tubule, what you have is you have an isoosmolar reabsorption of both water and sodium. So sodium goes out, water goes out, and because they go out in the same proportion, there is no osmolarity change. So you can see osmolarity inside the tube is 300, and it's still 300 as you go further down. However, as you start to descend down into the deeper and deeper down the cortex, you see that the concentration gradient is increasing. There's higher concentration out here, as you can see, and so that is going to cause, remember, water is going to go from a lower to a higher concentration gradient. So now we're going to see that water is going to start to come out, and we're going to see that the concentration inside the tubule is going to it's going to try to catch up to that concentration out in the cortex and the medulla. Okay. And this is all possible because this whole section, as we said, is it permeable to water or not? It is permeable. So as you keep going down, concentration keeps, even though your concentration just went up, if you're going down, this concentration out here is going up too. So water keeps going, and at the end of the day, when you're at the bottom of this loop of Henle, you have a very concentrated filtrate. It's going to be similar to the concentration in the medulla. Now what's going to happen next is, as you go back up, we're going to see, first of all, is this permeable or not to water? Remember, it's between the dotted line, so it's not permeable to water. The other thing to note is that we have a very high concentration of solute inside the tubules, but as we're going up, remember that the osmolarity is going to go lower and lower. So what's going to happen is that our solute is going to flow out. Our solute is going to flow out to even out the osmolarity. Solute is going to go down its concentration gradient, and so you see that our osmolarity of the fluid decreases as we go back up this loop of Henle. Okay, so basically there's a net reabsorption of salts from the lumen, leading to a decreased concentration of the filtrate. And again, finally, when we get to these collecting ducts, as we see here, everything depends on the hormonal activity of ADH for water reabsorption, and also for aldosterone for it's called aldo, for the NaCl reabsorption. Okay, so again, as you can see here, the reabsorption of this water and solutes, it's driven by these three things that I've said: by the increasing concentration as you go deeper into the medulla, by the loop structure, which helps you take advantage of that concentration gradient, and then there's the variable permeability of the nephron to water. All right, you don't necessarily have to memorize this, but it really helps you understand what's going on. Now I want to talk about excretion and reabsorption right now. Remember that after you filter in the fluid into the tubules, you're going to have excretion or reabsorption of different substances. And don't think of it as a vague process. You have to understand that there's actually transporters that are going to be mediating this. Okay, there's going to be transporters that help excrete things and transporters that help reabsorb things. And before we look at this chart, I want you to know that as the serum concentration of substance increases, its filtration will also increase. So more of that substance is going to be filtered if you have more of it in the blood, and that's pretty much common sense, okay? So let's start with PAH. Remember, PAH was the one that we said was maximally excreted. Okay, so to be filtered, and the stuff that doesn't, okay, let's draw it out again. We're going to go afferent arterial, efferent arterial, glomerulus. Okay, some of that PAH is going to go here, and I simplified it before and I just said all of it goes there, but not all of it is going to be filtered out. Some of that PAH is going to go here, and then it's going to go into the blood vessels after that. What were the blood vessels after the efferent arterial? It's going to be the peritubular capillaries. So this is the tubule. There's going to be little capillaries here. These are peritubular capillaries. And then there's going to be a lot of excretors. There's going to be a lot of transporters that help excrete PAH, okay? PAH is normally maximally excreted. So for a certain amount of pH that we have, we're going to excrete all we can, and we have a very steep slope because there's going to be a lot of, it's going to be a high amount that's excreted. However, my point here is that we have transporters, and eventually you're going to overload the amount of transporters you have. When your filtered amount is too high as you go to the right, you're going to overload your transporters, and eventually they're going to be working maximal already. So they're not going to transport anymore, and so your pH excretion is still going to increase because you have more filtered amount. And we just said, as you filter more, if you have more high concentration, you're going to filter more, okay? So filter more, but it's not going to be as steep because you're not going to be able to excrete anymore. Now, we're going to talk about glucose now. Glucose is similar, but it's the opposite, okay? Because glucose we have reabsorbed normally. So let's clear this. Normally, we don't see any glucose excretion. Okay, in your blood, if I check your urine and you don't have diabetes, you're not going to have any glucose in your urine because you reabsorb all of it, so there's zero that is excreted, hence why it's flat, even though you have a lot that's filtered. A lot of glucose can go through that glomerulus, but we're gonna reabsorb it. However, if you have too much glucose, again, there's transporters that are going to be mediating this. So if you have too much and you're going to overload all your transporters, eventually you're going to get to a point where you can't reabsorb anymore. You can't reabsorb any extra. And so glucose is going to start appearing in your urine. That's why it's going up. It's going to be some excreted amount. And you notice here, I talked about a Tmax. The Tmax here is basically just the transport maximum. And this is basically the maximum ability of these transporters to work. And this here is what you see in diabetes, okay? Diabetes is when you really high blood sugar. And these patients have much higher blood sugars than we do. And so their filtered amount is going to exceed the ability of the transporters to work. So you're going to start seeing excreted glucose in the urine. And that's why they've called it diabetes mellitus. Remember, that's for the sweet urine because they have sugar in their urine. Okay. So now let us go on to the nephron physiology. After we've just talked about how the concentration gradients work, we talk about transporters that help excrete and secrete. Now let's look at the little nitty-gritty details. We're going to take a look at the proximal convoluted tubule first, in the bottom right. So proximal convoluted tubule, the major function here is isoosmotic reabsorption of water and solutes. Okay. So there's going to be a lot of reabsorption. It's all going to be driven by the sodium gradient. And this gradient is created by the sodium potassium ATPase. Okay. This pump is going to, let's get out of here. This pump is going to kick sodium out of the cell, of the aluminum cell. So there's low sodium inside the cell. There's low concentration. So sodium is going to want to go down. And this concentration gradient from sodium in the lumen into the cell is going to drive a lot of transport. It's going to drive transport of glucose and many other molecules. For example, amino acids are going to go down with sodium. Phosphate is going to go down with sodium. Okay. The other thing that's going on is going to be a sodium and H plus exchange. So you can see here, sodium goes in again, and the H plus is going to go out to balance the charge. And this one is going to be important. I'm going to show you exactly why, and it's going to lead to bicarb reabsorption. When this H plus goes out, it's going to combine with bicarb. This is important because bicarb by itself cannot go into the cell. Okay, it needs this reaction. It needs to combine with H plus it's gonna become H2CO3. Something called carbonic anhydrase, that's an enzyme, is going to break down H2CO3 into water and carbon dioxide, and these two are able to cross. Okay, and then basically the whole reverse is going to happen. These two are just going to like flip the switch, rewind, and then turn back into H plus and then bicarb. And then, as you see here, the H plus is back where we just started, and now we have bicarb inside the cell, and it's able to be secreted into the interstitium in the blood. So this is very important. This actually helps us. You get net Na plus and bicarb reabsorption, and you don't even use any H plus. It's just being recycled. Okay. So the hormones that act here. What hormones act here? Well, PTH acts here. What does PTH do? Parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone helps increase serum levels of calcium, decrease serum levels of phosphate. And here, this is where it acts on the phosphate. There's normally a sodium, so if you look on here on the right, sodium phosphate cotransport. Okay, PTH blocks this. It decreases that, and thus you have decreased reabsorption of phosphate. You pee out your phosphate, decrease serum phosphate. Angiotensin works here. Angiotensin works on this. It stimulates this exchange, okay? And it stimulates this exchange. Remember what we said, it increases sodium and increases bicarb. And why would we want that? Remember, what was the trigger for angiotensin 2? We probably might not even have talked about it yet. But angiotensin 2 is when you have low blood volume and you want to increase your blood volume. This is a whole synthesis of everything. Remember, what was the key regulator of blood volume? Remember, we said it was osmolarity, and then blood volume is an extracellular fluid. So the main electrolyte there was sodium. So you want to increase sodium, and you do that by increasing. One way is by increasing this sodium reabsorption. Sodium comes in as well as bicarb, and that's why you call it a contraction alkalosis, because contraction means you're low volume. So in response, you're going to get angiotensin 2, you're going to get sodium bicarb, and that bicarb is going to cause that alkalosis. So that's why we call it contraction alkalosis. Now diuretics that act on the proximal convoluted tubule. Diuretics make you pee more, make you get more fluid, decrease water reabsorption. Osmotic diuretics act at the proximal convoluted tubule, because if you have a bunch of hyperosmolar things, there's going to be less water reabsorption, and instead you have high osmolarity. Water goes from low to high osmolarity. Water goes this way, and you have increased peeing out of water in the lumen with your urine. The other thing that works here is carbonic anhydrase inhibitors. So carbonic anhydrase inhibitors will block this. So basically this sodium and bicarb reabsorption doesn't happen. And so now you have more sodium in your urine, and then even more sodium, that's increased osmolarity. Water follows sodium. Water always follows sodium, and so you get diuresis. Okay, so next. We're going to focus we're still here on the proximal convoluted tubule. We talked about how we have a lot of reabsorption and secretion in the proximal convoluted tubule, including water. So as we read here, as the filtrate goes down the proximal convoluted tubule, substances are being reabsorbed and secreted, and then water is being reabsorbed. Okay. Our graph on the right is going to show us how concentrations of different substances change as they go down the proximal convoluted tubule. And it looks at the tubular fluid to plasma ratio. This looks at the concentration of the substance as it goes down the proximal tubule and compares it to the initial concentration when it was in the Bowman space. So this tells you, basically, so this is the concentration at the point you measure it, and this is the original concentration right at the Bowman space, which is the same as the plasma concentration. Okay, should be. So this tells you how it's changed, and the change tells you if the substance is being reabsorbed or secreted in comparison to water. So a positive slope means that the concentration has increased. And you can have an increased concentration as you go further down the tubule for two reasons. One, it's being secreted, so there's more in the lumen, so increased concentration. The other reason is it's being reabsorbed less quickly than water, because water is being reabsorbed too. So if it's being reabsorbed but not as quickly as water, then concentration still goes up. So the ones that have increased slopes, which means that their concentration is going up, are basically PAH, creatinine, inulin, and urea. Next, if we look at the ones with kind of a flat slope, So chloride does increase in concentration for a while, but eventually as you reach a certain point in the tubule, chloride flattens out, and so does potassium. So what does a flat slope mean? What is the concentration? What is the tubular to plasma ratio? How has the concentration changed? Concentration has not changed, hence why the ratio is about the same. So that means that it's not being reabsorbed as secreted at all. It means that it's being reabsorbed at the same rate as water, okay? Because water is being reabsorbed here. So now we finished looking at the ones with the increased slope. Which what does that mean? Either that it's being secreted or it's being reabsorbed slowly and less than water. Flat slopes, which mean what? Which mean that the substance being reabsorbed at the same rate as water. Finally, we can look at the slopes, the negative slopes, as we can see here. And what would that mean? Having a negative slope means that the concentration is decreasing as you go down the proximal tubule. As you go down the proximal tubule, concentration decreases. And why would it decrease? Because you're reabsorbing more of the substance than you are of water. So you reabsorb a lot of bicarb, a lot of amino acids, and a lot of glucose. Remember, the glucose we already know about, we just talked about that, how pretty much usually there's no glucose in your urine in a normal person because we reabsorb so much of it. So its concentration decreases a lot. Same for amino acids, same for bicarb. Okay. So now we continue on with our nephron physiology. So we just finished talking a lot about this, the proximal convoluted tubule. Now we're going to talk about the loop of Henle on the right. So now, and this is the thick ascending limb of the loop of Henle, so it's this part. Okay, the function of this thick ascending limb is reabsorption of water with, reabsorption of sodium, with no water reabsorption. Okay, why do we say that? Remember, this is impermeable to water. Remember we said that? Section is impermeable to water. If you're reabsorbing sodium and without water reabsorption, what's going to happen to your tubular fluid? It's going to get diluted. Okay, and the mechanism for this sodium reabsorption is right here on the right. It's a sodium, potassium, and 2-chloride co-transport. The reason why is so you can have balance of all your charges. See, there's 2 positive charges, 2 negative charges, very balanced. The other thing that's going to happen is, first, okay, let me explain this. You're going to get a bunch of chloride inside the cells of the lumen, inside the tubular cells to be exact. So now you have high concentration of chloride, and this chloride is going to go down its concentration gradient in 2 ways. It can go down into the interstitium and into the blood for reabsorption, or you can send it back into the lumen with the urine. And so that's going to both are going to happen, and so now you're going to actually have increased lumen potential. There's going to be increased positive lumen potential. And you have these calcium and magnesium positive ions here. They're not going to like this positive lumen potential, so that's going to drive them paracellularly into the interstitium and blood. So that's what this is, paracellular reabsorption of magnesium and calcium. Okay, so your 2 cellular mechanisms are that co-transport of sodium, potassium, chloride, and you have paracellular reabsorption of magnesium and calcium. And then the diuretic that acts here will be loop diuretics, and their function is to block this. They're going to block this, block sodium reabsorption. Where sodium, water follows sodium, so you have more sodium in here, water is going to follow, and you're going to get diuresis. Okay, next, we keep going down. We're now in the distal convoluted tubule in the bottom right. And if you look at the early distal convoluted tubule, again, remember when we said that that was impermeable to water. So again, you get reabsorption of sodium, as well as chloride, without water. So again, you get dilution of tubular fluid. The way you do this is with the sodium on the right. You see here, sodium chloride co-transport. Okay. Now, the hormone that acts here is PTH. Again, we talked about PTH. We said PTH increases serum calcium, decreases serum phosphate. And the way, remember we said how it decreases serum phosphate. We just talked about this. Decrease serum phosphate in the proximal convoluted tubule by blocking that sodium phosphate co-transport. And now it's going to act to increase calcium through stimulating calcium reabsorption. It's going to do this in a certain way. Basically, on the apical side, so that's the side of the blood in the interstitium, there's a sodium and calcium exchanger, as you can see here. PTH stimulates this, so you're going to have increased sodium you're going to actually have decreased calcium in the cell, in the tubular cell. So now you're going to increase you now have a nice gradient for calcium in the lumen to go in. So that's it, simple as that. You stimulate calcium to go into the blood, and so now you're going to let more calcium go in. So it's like, I don't know, it's like immigration or something. Okay, you have calcium wants to immigrate into the blood. You have this terrible customs, customs border security, terrible, they're very slow. So you have a lot of calcium here, and so that there's a whole line, so this calcium in the lumen can't go. PTH basically kicks the custom people's ass, makes them work harder. So you have increased calcium leaving the tubular cell, and now you're freeing up space for these calcium guys in the lumen to enter, okay? So, what diuretic acts here? Diuretic is diazides, okay? So diazides act on the sodium chloride cotransport. They block it. So again, you increase your sodium, again water follows. So again, what was the diuretic that acts on the loop of Henle? Remember, the diuretic acting on the loop of Henle is the loop diuretics, hence their name. So easy loop diuretics that act on the loop of Henle. Diazides act on the distal convoluted tubule. Finally, we go to this collecting duct. Okay, collecting duct, key function here is reabsorption of sodium in exchange for potassium and H+. Note that I've bolded this. I haven't bolded anything yet, I don't think, in Nephron physiology, but I have bolded this section because it is super important. You're going to see this over and over again, and the reason why is it's going to affect your potassium levels, so you can get hypokalemia, hyperkalemia due to abnormalities here. It's going to affect your hydrogen levels, your acid levels. So this can cause some metabolic acidosis, metabolic alkalosis. You're going to see this over and over again, so be sure to know this. Okay, the mechanism for this is going to be through sodium channels and through potassium channels, okay? And then the other function here is water reabsorption, and that's through aquaporins, as you can see here. Remember, this is governed by ADH, so this is the hormones acting here. Aquaporins, water reabsorption governed by ADH, and then aldosterone is going to govern this reabsorption of sodium in exchange for potassium or the hydrogen acid. And then the diuretic that acts here is going to be called a potassium sparing diuretic. There's two types. They can either block aldosterone, and aldosterone stimulates the sodium reabsorption. It can block this aldosterone, blocks aldosterone, the receptor, or it can directly block this sodium channel. Again, both lead to decreased sodium reabsorption, more sodium in the lumen. Okay? Now, I just want to re-emphasize this so it's important. You have sodium reabsorption, potassium or H+ leave, and this happens because of the charge balance, okay? Now, this was for the principal cells in the collecting duct. There's multiple types of cells. There's also an alpha intercalated cell in the collecting duct. I'll talk really quickly about this. The alpha intercalated cells are responsible for either H+ secretion, as you see here, or potassium reabsorption. And it's through these channels. Alright, that's basically it for our nephron physiology. I have here a chart that I'm going to review, I'm going to quiz you on. You can quiz yourself, you can finish and skip to the next video, or you can follow along. So what is the major function of the proximal convoluted tubule? A major function is that isoosmotic reabsorption of water and solutes. So both of them are being reabsorbed at this point. Remember, there's the cellular mechanism for this. What was it? Remember, we have the sodium co-transports, so sodium glucose, sodium phosphate, sodium amino acid, all co-transports. And then you also have that sodium and H+ exchange that's going to drive sodium and bicarb reabsorption. Okay, the hormones that act at the proximal convoluted tubule, what are they? Do you remember? Hormones that act were PTH. PTH blocks that sodium phosphate co-transport, thus decreasing phosphate reabsorption and serum phosphate levels. And then angiotensin II. Angiotensin II, how does that work? Remember, that stimulates that sodium H+ exchange, and that is going to enhance the sodium bicarb reabsorption. Okay, that's going to increase your blood volume. at the expense of having a little bit of alkalosis because of that bicarb, hence the name contraction alkalosis that I talked about. Now what diuretic is going to act here? Remember the osmotic diuretics act here, and then the carbonic anhydrase inhibitors act here. Remember they block the carbonic anhydrase that's very important for this exchange. Now we go to the thick ascending limb. What is the major function of the thick ascending limb? Remember this reabsorption of sodium without water absorption because it's impermeable to water, and this leads to a dilution of the tubular fluid. Okay. The mechanism for this was through a sodium-potassium chloride cotransport. And remember, we also had that paracellular reabsorption of magnesium and calcium. And remember, what was the diuretic that acts here? We're at the loop of Henle, so it's the loop diuretic. Okay, no hormones acting here. Next, early distal convoluted tubule. What is the major function here? Same as the loop of Henle, reabsorption of sodium without water, leading to dilution of tubular fluid. Okay, they have the same major function. The only difference is the cellular mechanism is a little different. The thick ascending limb has this potassium sodium 2-chloride cotransport. Early distal convoluted tubule has that sodium chloride cotransport. Okay, and this one actually has a hormone acting on it. Remember, it's PTH again, stimulating that calcium reabsorption. And what was the diuretic that acts here? Diuretic that acts here is thiazides. So thiazides at the distal convoluted tubule, loop diuretics at the thick ascending limb of the loop of Henle. Finally, collecting tubule principal and alpha intercalated cells. What was the major function? Remember, it was reabsorption of sodium in exchange for potassium H+, and then also water reabsorption. And what were the cellular mechanisms for this? Remember, this cellular mechanism was sodium H+, K+ channels. This one was aquaporin channels, okay? What was the hormone that works on this one? Hormone that works on this one is aldosterone. Stimulates potassium, sodium reabsorption, and K+ secretion, or H+ sometimes. And then what was the hormone that acts here that causes aquaporin placement and water reabsorption? Hormone is ADH. Okay. And what was the diuretic that acts at the collecting duct? Remember, the diuretic is the potassium-sparing diuretics, and we're going to explain later why it's called a potassium-sparing diuretic. But this is the one that acts directly, either blocks aldosterone action or it acts directly to block the sodium channels. So that's a whirlwind tour of the nephron physiology. Make sure you know all of this though. This is already very dumbed down, so make sure you know everything that's going on here. Very important, very, very relevant for the rest of the renal system.